giant of limitless power at man's command. And where was it science found that giant? In the atom, a particle so infinitely small that it takes over 100 billion atoms to make up the head of a pin.
This is Out of the Basement, a podcast dedicated to radiation medicine.
This is Dr. Jason Becker beaming at you out of my Vermont mountain basement, here to stir the pot yet again with our favorite and oft-debated issue in radiation medicine, that of the risk of secondary cancers from radiation exposures, especially when those exposures may or may not be low dose or LDRT. And LDRT, obviously, is a concept and topic that draws intense reaction recently, and what inspires this episode on a discussion on X, formerly Twitter, a notable radiation oncologist who may or may not be in Chicago chimed in on a thread talking about LDRT, warning us about the horrors of radiation for conditions like ankylosing spondylitis and tinea capitis. In those particular conditions, and that research will be covered in a future episode, but today, in honor or inspired by that conversation on X, I want to turn to a lesser known case, but probably my favorite case of using radiation for benign condition, and that's nasopharyngeal radium treatments, which was primarily done between about 1920 and the early 1950s. And the reason I love this is that I accidentally found this. This was done 2 years ago whenever I started doing this podcasting, radiophobia stuff, and happened upon a 2003 report from the NIH, from the government itself, saying how they estimate that between 500,000 and 2.5 million people, predominantly children, had received these nasopharyngeal brachytherapy treatments, and there is no conclusive evidence at all that any of those people developed cancer. Now, there are certainly reports and things that have potentially increased risk or relative risk, but none of them were statistically significant or really conclusive. And some show the opposite, which is very fascinating. And this is a very interesting sort of story. And back in the day, this is again from the 20s to the 50s, this was pretty widely done. So in kids, it was done for adenitis and things of that nature. What I like, and there's some papers maybe we'll get to in the future, it was used for barotrauma or aerotitis media among military personnel in World War II, like pilots and submariners. And it was quite effective. And the method for this is a little interesting to think about. So they took 25 to 50 milligrams of radium on these long applicators and shoved an applicator in each nostril and held it there for 8 to 12 minutes and did that every 14 days for a total of 3 fractions. It was a pretty whopping dose of radium, right? And so you would expect, especially if you're zapping kids with that dose, that you would see a clear signal of secondary malignancies. And that was not the case. And you would be led to believe otherwise if you read secondary sources, textbooks or lectures or whatnot, and even in the primary sources that are citing other primary sources, because that's what is ingrained in the culture of science and medicine and public and policy is radiation bad, radiation bad, radiation danger. But most of the studies that are cited when this claim is made, if any studies are cited at all, do not support such a thing. And so in preparing for a different episode on a paper I like, and I use that word somewhat ironically, but there's a 2017 paper that is titled The Adenoid, Its History and a Cautionary Tale, written by a very eminent ENT surgeon named Robert J. Rubin, who is a fellow of 2 professional surgical societies and is a retired chair and endowed professor of a couple med schools. And I like the paper in that it's very well written, and it is really about institutional authority and informed consent and a lot of good topics. However, the thrust of it is how insane it was to give radium treatments to kids, because radiation bad. And I, like I talked about in prior episodes, think it's very important when you see these things, when you see claims that are made in the scientific literature, you should always check the sources, check what they're citing to say that. So in this 2017 paper, Dr. Rubin here makes the claim, there's table 2, and it's titled Relative Risk and Confidence Limits of Head and Neck Cancer in Patients' Long-Term Follow-Up. And there are 3 studies he cites. And then he says that these three studies, all three of them, revealed an increased relative risk for head and neck cancer. And that based on the results from all three large-scale follow-up studies, it was included that the use of radon therapy in the nasopharynx for a benign condition is contraindicated. Small little wrinkle there. That's not what these papers show at all. So 2 of the 3 show a potential increase, not significant, and 1 of the 3 does not show that at all. And even I am assuming Dr. Rubin does not understand how statistics work, because the relative risk confidence interval crosses 1. So the first study he cites has a relative risk of 4.22, but the CI, the confidence interval, is 0.38 to 46.59. The next one is relative risk of 1.30, the CI going from 0.64 to 2.71. And the final one, the relative risk is 1.47, with the CI going from 0.61 to 3.50. Now, for any of us who have ever actually taken a elementary school level course on statistics, if your relative risk confidence interval crosses 1, it is not significant, because that's a lot of noise. I was very intrigued by this first one with a CI that went up to 46.59 with the lower level of 0. That's quite insane. And so I figured it would be easiest to just focus on that one paper. This paper was published in 2001 in the American Journal of Epidemiology. It is titled Cancer Incidence After Childhood Nasopharyngeal Radium Irradiation, a Follow-Up Study in Washington County, Maryland. Very compelling title there. Let's go ahead and take a listen to the abstract.
A population from a hearing clinic in Washington County, Maryland, in 1943 through 1960 was followed to assess the risk of developing neoplasms from radium treatment of the nasopharynx for adenoid hypertrophy. Of the 2,925 subjects who attended the clinic, 904 received radium treatment. A non-concurrent prospective study compared the cancer incidence among the irradiated persons with that among persons with other treatments. 7 brain tumor cases, 3 malignant and 4 benign, were identified in the irradiated group versus none in the non-irradiated group. Relative risk equals 14.8, 95% confidence interval, 0.76 to 286.3. A non-significant excess risk of thyroid cancer was detected in the irradiated group based on 2 cases in the exposed group and 1 case in the non-exposed group. Relative risk equals 4.2, 95% confidence interval, 0.38 to 46.6. Decreased risks of breast cancer, female genital cancers, and prostate cancer were observed among the irradiated individuals, although these deficits were not statistically significant individually. The decreased risk of sex hormone-related cancers in the irradiated group suggests possible radiation damage to the pituitary, with consequent reduction in pituitary hormone output and alterations in sexual and other hormonal development in early life. This hypothesis needs further evaluation.
Well, hopefully astute listeners will hear immediate and tremendous terrible problems with this paper just from the abstract. First, the line 7 brain tumor cases, 3 malignant and 4 benign, were identified in the irradiated group versus none in the non-irradiated group. Well, so again, that relative risk is listed as 14.8, but the CI, the 95% confidence interval, goes from 0.76 to 286.3. I don't know. This is not scientific. They should be embarrassed. I hope the writers of this paper, the authors, hear this someday, and you should feel bad about this. This is bad. And a couple things about this. One, it's really just 3 tumors versus 1, so 3 malignant, because you cannot conflate benign brain tumors with malignant brain tumors. GBM does not form and have the same characteristics and prognosis and natural history as a meningioma. So conflating these two is just, none of these people are MDs, I don't believe, the authors, and we'll get to them in a second. But there's clearly, there's no clinical sense to that. 2, the 3 versus 0, those are not numbers that you can do statistics with. And we'll talk about that in a second. But 4, if your CI goes from less than 1 to almost 300, you should probably rethink what you're doing here. Same to be said with the line, a non-significant excess risk of thyroid cancer was detected in the irradiated group based on 2 cases in the exposed group and 1 case in the non-exposed group. Again, and this is what was cited in the 2017 Rubin paper, relative risk of 4.2 with the CI going from 0.38 to 46.6. But the way this is worded leads one to believe that there's an excess risk. And the real story in this paper is kind of buried at the end of this abstract without any numbers, that there was a decreased risk of breast cancer, female genital cancers, and prostate cancer observed in the irradiated individuals, although these deficits were not statistically significant individually. Oh, interesting, because when you phrase it like that, that means that they were significant in aggregate, but you don't want to say that because you don't want to say that low dose of radiation for benign condition actually decreased cancer. Can't say that. And they do say, and I do think this is probably the case, that the decreased risk of these hormone-related cancers were likely due to alterations in hormones from pituitary damage. That is a reasonable sort of hypothesis. Before we go further into the body of this paper, let's take a look at the authors of this paper. So there are 5 authors on it. And if we look at the senior authors, it is a man named George W. Comstock. If you Google Dr. Comstock and look at his Wikipedia, you discover that he was the editor-in-chief for the American Journal of Epidemiology for about a decade until the late 80s. And then starting in the early 90s, he became the editor-in-chief emeritus of the American Journal of Epidemiology. He held that position, editor-in-chief emeritus, from 1991 to 2007. And let's take a look. What journal was this paper published? Oh, it was the American Journal of Epidemiology. So, there's some obvious flaws just right in the abstract. I wonder how such a paper got published. Oh, maybe because the senior author is the editor-in-chief emeritus. Well, usually guys like that, even though these people are all at Johns Hopkins, probably not really involved in this work, but who's the second to last author on this? It's a woman named Dale Sandler. And if you go to the Wikipedia entry for Dale Sandler, she is the chief of the epidemiology branch at the NIH, the Environmental Health Sciences section, and a past president of the American College of Epidemiology. Okay, so I'm going to assume this is probably her work. Why would I say that? Well, or at least her idea. So the second author on this paper is a woman named Genevieve Malinowski. Genevieve Malinowski is a very senior, and I think she passed away some time ago, very senior member in Hopkins at the time, who was actually the dissertation advisor for Dale Sandler. And what was Dale Sandler's dissertation again? Oh, well, so it was written in 1979, and it's titled Health Consequences of Nasopharyngeal Radium Irradiation. Well, that's interesting. So we've got the editor-in-chief emeritus of the journal this paper is published in. We have a woman whose doctoral dissertation was on this subject and her advisor for her dissertation. We'll get to the other 2 authors in a minute here, but let's take a listen to a couple paragraphs from Dr. Sandler's dissertation, because it kind of proves my point of all of this being a pyramid scheme.
Several studies have concerned the thyroid cancer risk for individuals who received head and neck irradiation for enlarged tonsils and adenoids. Whereas individuals who received thymic irradiation were primarily under 1 year of age at exposure, individuals who received X-ray treatment of enlarged tonsils and adenoids were generally between 5 and 15 years old. One of the earlier reports of the effects of tonsillar X-ray was by Ullman in 1956. Only 480 of 2,500 individuals who were exposed to less than 20 rads to the thyroid were contacted. However, 4 thyroid cancers were observed at 8, 14, 15, and 19 years after treatment. No comparison group was mentioned in the report. In a survey of individuals irradiated for lymphoid hyperplasia of the nasopharynx, 1 thyroid cancer was observed 6 years after exposure to between 80 and 800 rads to the thyroid. Hazen reported 3 thyroid cancers in 971 exposed individuals, expected 0.08, after an average 12-year follow-up. Thyroid exposure depended on many factors, and a great deal of individual variation in exposure existed. However, the thyroid exposures for Hazen's population have been estimated to have been between 10 and 600 rads, with the lower doses representing thyroids not directly in the X-ray beam. No malignant tumors were observed for untreated siblings, and one benign tumor was observed for each group. Results from Hazen's study are consistent with those in a report by Hanford. Thyroid exposures following irradiation for benign neck lesions were reported for 458 exposed individuals after a follow-up period of 10 to 24 years. This was 8 times that expected from population rates. Sanger, too, reported many times the expected number of thyroid cancers, 11 versus 0.12. Follow-up averaged 16 years, and the study population consisted of individuals irradiated for a variety of reasons. Thyroid exposures were not given. No thyroid cancer was reported for non-irradiated sibling controls.
So if you found that a little confusing, so did I, and mostly because it does not really build the case well. So what struck me about that was those dose ranges are estimates, and they're huge, sometimes spanning hundreds of rads or more. And they are bad studies that she's citing, things that don't have control groups or things that don't really have anything conclusive in them. And so my point with going down this rabbit hole, we'll go down it one level further, is that this is how this goes. In the last episode, we talked about Herman Muller and his Nobel speech, ignoring data from Ernst Kaspari and still proudly and definitively proclaiming that there is no threshold below which radiation is not going to cause harm. And then it goes from there and snowballs, and everybody's citing everybody else, and it's a game of telephone. And when the narrative is one thing, the game of telephone goes in a certain direction. And you start seeing this, where the arguments are weak, the citations are weak, the things that people are saying and providing citations for, well, their citations are not saying, they're not supporting what these people are saying. And it takes a lot of energy and effort to go down this rabbit hole. And, when you look at one of these papers that then Sandler cites, so we'll go specifically into the 1962 paper, which, because part of why I went into that one in particular is the way she wrote that made no sense. The 458 exposed individuals, I don't know if that was an error or if she wants you to do the math, because she doesn't actually say how many people got cancer. It doesn't make sense. And I want to say, did no one proofread her dissertation, but no one proofread my dissertation. So it's possible it's just an error, because I could not really piece together what she was trying to say there, which is part of the reason I went and dug this out. And this is a 1962 paper published in our favorite JAMA, titled Cancer Arising Many Years After Radiation, Incidence After Radiation of Benign Lesions in the Neck. So this is the summary and conclusion section.
A study of 458 patients irradiated for non-malignant disease in the neighborhood of the thyroid gland at the Presbyterian Hospital between 1920 and 1950 has been carried out to determine the incidence of thyroid cancer in thyroid glands incidentally or deliberately irradiated. The 3 main groups of patients were those having enlarged thymus, toxic goiter, and tuberculous adenitis. The first 2 groups showed no significant increase in thyroid cancer or in all cancer above statistical expectation. Admittedly, the thymus group was too small to warrant drawing any conclusions. However, in the group with tuberculous adenitis, in addition to the expected incidence of all cancer, 7 cases of thyroid cancer appeared. These cancers were found at operation 10 to 27 years after the irradiation. 2 patients had been irradiated in childhood at 4 and 9 years. The cancers developed 13 and 18 years later. 1 patient was irradiated during adolescence at 15 years. Cancer developed 11 years later. The others were irradiated at 18, 23, and 34 years of age, respectively, the cancers appearing from 10 to 27 years later. Thus, only 1 cancer in this group appeared in an individual under 20 years of age. All other patients were more than 25. These cancers, therefore, cannot be considered as childhood cancers. The radiation doses to the thyroid gland, estimated as carefully as possible from the hospital records, were between 500 and 1,500 Rentgen. In a smaller group of non-irradiated tuberculous adenitis cases, no thyroid cancers were found. It thus appears that the disease itself is probably not responsible for the development of cancer, but that small doses of radiation to the gland may sometimes act as at least a part of the provocation. A check was made to see whether the large number of lost cases could have been responsible for false conclusions. The percentage of lost cases is essentially the same in all disease groups. The percentage of losses is somewhat lower in the under 20 age group than in the older for both tuberculous adenitis and hyperthyroidism. If no thyroid cancers had occurred among the lost cases, the incidence of this condition in the adenitis group would still be excessive. If any of the lost patients did develop thyroid cancer, it would only make the situation worse. It appears that there is no distortion of conclusions because of the number of cases which it was impossible to follow for the total period of the study.
The main thing that jumps out at me from this paper is, again, their data does not support their conclusions either, where they basically say they have no control group because every single person who came in for this treatment at Presby in that time period, they all got surgery and radiation. And so they tried to make a control group, but they couldn't because everyone got this treatment. And my other favorite thing is the whole speculations about adenoid or adenitis. So they're saying that the impression at the time was that patients with adenitis tuberculosis had less cancer. The impression, they don't provide no citation for that. That's the impression. And then the very next sentence says that they saw an increased risk or an increased incidence of just thyroid cancer in this group. And the incidence of other cancers was the same as control. They disprove their own argument in the next sentence. So if that impression was true, that adenitis tuberculosis actually has a lower incidence of cancer, you would expect lower cancers compared to control, but they see the same. By definition, that is their own assertion, their own hypothesis is incorrect. Second of all, they discard important aspects of their own data. They have three groups, and in those three groups, they had patients receiving treatment for enlarged thymus, toxic goiter, tuberculosis adenitis. The thymus and toxic goiter group showed no significant increase in thyroid cancer or in all cancer above statistical expectations. They hand-wave that away by saying the thymus group is too small. So, the bulk of their work here shows no increased incidence of thyroid cancer after nasopharyngeal brachy, but they throw it away and they focus only on the one group. And in the one group, they try to make the argument that this data is even more significant because the impression is that the tuberculosis adenitis group has less cancer overall, but then disprove that with their own data. This is the sandcastle. This is the house of lies that this is all built on. So we have this 1962 paper. It is clearly just not good, but I'm putting it charitably. This 1962 paper is cited in the 1979 dissertation by Sandler as part of her overall argument that nasopharyngeal radium increased secondary malignancy or caused secondary malignancy, increasing the rates of cancer. Then you have Sandler as the second senior author on this paper, which we'll talk about more in a second, again, claiming things in the abstract that the data does not support, which is then being cited down the line by this 2017 paper, very definitively, very concretely saying that this was one of the papers that showed why this went away. None of this is true. None of this is real. And it's really interesting when you take a look at the author bylines of this 2001 paper. So going back to the Maryland paper. All right, so we have George Comstock, senior author, editor-in-chief emeritus of the journal this paper is published in. Dale Sandler, second senior author, who has a dissertation on this exact topic, who I think was the one organizing this. Genevieve Madinat. What I suspect happened here is Genevieve is Sandler's mentor. I suspect that they worked on this data set when they were younger. So this is kind of an update because this paper had been published previously before. And I don't know if she actually contributed. I think she probably contributed to the first one. So this was more of an homage, is my guess, being in this world. But when you look at the little blurb, you can always find or should hopefully always be able to find some technical details about the publication. So it says, even though they've got the editor-in-chief emeritus on this paper, it says received for publication October 21st, 1999, and accepted for publication August 10th, 2000. It took almost a year for this paper to get accepted, which is a little weird given what this paper is about and the data contained therein, where I could understand this paper taking a long time to put together because it's all longitudinal cohort stuff and they sent out surveys, and I could see it taking a long time to collect, but it's not a very complicated paper in terms of what it looks at. It's basically doing your basic sort of epidemiology statistics where they're doing Poisson regression and Cox proportional hazards model. So if they felt like they could submit it for publication in 1999, October 1999, what in the world took a year to redo in this paper? And so my main hypothesis being in this world and knowing how these things go. So I think this was probably a pet project of Madanowski and Sandler, and the first author and the third author. So the first author goes by, it's on her profile at Hopkins, Jessica Ye, and the third author is a man named Dr. Wang. They're both now associate professors or more. Hopkins has weird titles and stuff. They're still at Hopkins. So this paper was submitted in October of 1999. Well, the first author was a postdoc at the time. So she defended her PhD in 1998. And the third author, Wang, he defended his PhD in 1999. And that's when this paper was submitted. And so they were both grad students or fresh postdocs when this paper was submitted originally. And then when it was published, they were both postdocs. What I suspect is that the Sandler or Madanowski, maybe Comstock had something to do with this, I don't know, said, let's update this data set because now we published this before and let's publish it again. And these two junior members were tasked with actually doing this work. And what I've seen before, I would love to have seen the October 1999 submission, because what I'm wondering is if there is something fatally flawed about this. Well, obviously there is. So when you look at this data is bad. So these numbers are very small. These are non-significant for what they're trying to claim here. And I would not be surprised if there was a desk rejection. So maybe this paper got shelved, and through some conversation over the next year, maybe one of them ran into Comstock and said, hey, would you mind being a co-author on this so we can publish it? It's usually handled a little bit more delicately like that. But I would bet that the first edition, this first attempt, was just 4 authors. And then Comstock was added in, it was resubmitted, and then it was accepted. That is complete and utter speculation on my part. I have no evidence of that. It's weird that Comstock is on here as the editor-in-chief emeritus, yet it took a year for it to be accepted, and it's not that complicated. I don't really have a good way to explain that otherwise. But that's just kind of how this game works. Now, I bring this up not to claim that anyone is being deceitful. In fact, I would bet my left foot every single person on this paper believes what they're writing here. They believe that nasopharyngeal radiation in children caused cancer and it's bad. I would bet that. I would bet that because that's the narrative is that the establishment, the mainstream scientists have set forever now. So, we talked about the 1946 Nobel speech last time, but this was policy. This was United States policy starting in 1956 that there's no safe level of radiation. And we've lived with that. And we've lived with the atomic bombs and the Cold War and Chernobyl and Fukushima and the fear of radiation. And so this is the narrative that they're trying to fit. They're doing this stuff unconsciously. So what I would bet when they see these bad numbers, so when they see the thyroid thing is my favorite. So they see that there's 2 cases of thyroid cancer in the irradiated group versus 1. So they say, well, obviously we all know, that any level of radiation can cause cancer. So that's real. They have to do a statistical trick in this for both the brain and the thyroid to even perform the relative risk calculations. So they have to use something called Haldane's correction. So they add an incidence of 0.5 to each group to even be able to do this. That's how small, because there's 0. For brain tumors, there is 0 in the unexposed, and there's only 1 for thyroid in the unexposed. So they actually had to do Haldane's correction to add numbers in to even be able to do this. But they did not think to themselves, this is bad science. This is bad math. They thought our data is just, we don't have enough people. If we had enough people, we would see it clearly. So therefore, this is justified. And I don't think they thought that with any level of deceit. And I say this because this is why there's no paper from my dissertation work. So my PhD, I can't remember what I used as my exact title. It was something about the G2M decatenation checkpoint in human pluripotent stem cells, in genomic instability, Aurora A and BRCA, blah, 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 blah. I don't know. So I was trying to demonstrate, I did this whole thing for years on a specific subset of the G2M checkpoint. It's called the decatenation checkpoint. I would induce it through a drug called ICRF183. And I had built all this data and all these things up in the final step before my PI would be allegedly okay with submitting it for publication, was to show the mechanism. So I had all this other stuff, but he's like, we need a mechanism. So in 2004, there was a paper published showing that Aurora A, a kinase, phosphorylates BRCA1, and that was responsible for G2M checkpoints. So I said, maybe this is the mechanism here. And in one of the early experiments, I was able to see co-localization of Aurora A and BRCA1 in my stem cells in response to exposure to the ICRF183. And I said, this is it. It's established. This is it. I could never get that experiment to work again. I spent a year of my life, the final year in the lab before going back to med school, trying to get this experiment to work. I could not. I could tell you, I could wax and wane poetically for hours about different blocking solutions and reagents and extraction protocols for REPA buffer and yada, yada, yada. And it was a year of my life, and I thought it was me. I thought I was the problem. And so I published a bunch of other papers and other stuff, but to this day, my dissertation work is in my dissertation, obviously, but it's not in a peer-reviewed publication, and that is why. So fast forward to later on. I don't even remember when. I don't remember what, maybe 2018, 2019. So there's a site called Retraction Watch where it is people who find problems in papers, and it's fun. You should check it out. It's a great contribution to science. It's actually helpful. So on Retraction Watch, I discover that the 2004 paper that I based my mechanistic theory on was fraudulent. So that 2004 paper had almost 200 citations, very well established. It was the reason that this interaction was thought to be. And it was discovered that the main figure showing this interaction was fake, and the paper was retracted. And those authors, it's a really interesting story in a certain sense. They've discovered a lot of other problematic things in the group's papers, and a lot of them have been pulled, and it's been a big thing. But, that was the basis of my work. I believed that was the establishment narrative. At the time when I was doing these experiments, the establishment narrative was that Aurora A phosphorylated BRCA1, and that was a way that you could activate the G2M checkpoint. And when I could never get the experiments to work, I thought it was me. I thought it was the technique. I thought it was the reagents. I thought it was the modality. I don't think I ever questioned if the underlying assumption was true. And even if I did, I don't think my PI would have let me pursue it. But I never considered for a moment, or at least I don't think so, that maybe the assumption was wrong, because if you think about that, that has a lot of implications, right? So in a paper that's been cited almost 200 times about this fundamental thing, if that is fraudulent, which it was, what does that mean? And I'll touch these waters a little bit just to think about the wider world in 2004 as I talk about this. It's really hard when you start going down these rabbit holes of saying, well, I don't think this figure of authority, this institution of authority is being totally truthful about this thing. And when you start tugging on that thread, some people, the implications of that are overwhelming. And it's easier to stay in your box, to put your head in the sand and ignore it, rather than really pull at that thread, because it really tears down your whole worldview. There have been many such instances like this that have happened to me in my life, which has created the weird guy that you hear today. But so in these radiation papers and these radiation risk papers, that's what I think is happening here. This is objectively bad. Like if you take and stand, as I am, far removed, over 20 years removed from when this was published, I can see these stupid relative risk numbers as claims about excess risk without significance. This is bad. This is just objectively bad. And I know the authors probably knew it wasn't the best, but they probably didn't think for a moment that maybe the underlying assumption was wrong. And because that NIH thing that was published later on showing that there was no known risk or incidence of increased cancer on 2.5 million people. It was 2 years after this study. And I think this study was one of the reasons that the NIH put out that 2003 thing. But I'd say all this to just really point out that I don't think people are being deceitful here. I don't think when Ralph gets on Twitter or X and starts yelling about radiation risk, I think he thinks it. I think he means it. He's not trying to invoke or boogeyman or liar. I think he really thinks it. And I think most of them do. I think they're being genuine. And they should be commended for that. I think they're wrong. I think they're demonstrably wrong. And I think that it's bad that they don't reconsider their position. It's not coming from a place of evilness or malice or anything. I think they're just misguided. And they're misguided because, like in Ralph's case, for decades, in the very discipline he has spent his life in, that has been the prevailing notion. That has been what everyone, quote unquote, knows to be true. We can go through the very specific weaknesses of this paper, and they work well because you can extrapolate the shortcomings here and why these conclusions are problematic in other papers of this sort. And I just want to acknowledge epidemiology is hard. By the very nature of it, you're always going to be working from flawed sources. So I do want to acknowledge that. And I don't want to seem like I'm throwing stones from glass houses here, because I think this work is hard and it needs to be continued to be done and attempted. But I think a lot of these epidemiological studies need to be interpreted more cautiously than what they are. And so the first issue is just the study population itself, where now the strength, which is also a weakness, is that these are all subjects that were identified from the records of a hearing clinic in Washington County, Maryland. And so it has a lot of longitudinal records starting with childhood that other data sources don't have. And so the study period goes from 1940 to 1960, and the initial eligible study population was 2,925 people. And so of those 2,925 people, the exposed group, the people treated with radium brachy, was 904. And the people who had gotten other types of treatments was 2,021. So the initial study, and this is why I hypothesize about how this paper came to be. So remember, Dale Sandler's dissertation was written in 1979. And so the initial work for this paper was done in 1978. And they identified 2,627 people from that initial cohort in 1978. And then there was a follow-up. They were traced and contacted again in 1994 through 1995. And eventually it leads to, which is what this data is based on. So you have a total of 1,703 people who were both alive and eligible and responded to the questionnaire. So I don't want to claim that this is specific to this paper. It's just endemic to this type of work. You start with an eligible population, or original population of 2,925. And then this data is based on 1,703 of those people, which is still much better than many studies of this sort, to be very clear. But by the nature of this, you're introducing bias, and even as arguably as good as that is. So the other issue from that, for those of us who have been in practice or seen things, when you are getting data from just one clinic, it can be difficult to generalize, especially radiation-specific findings, to the rest of the country or the world, specifically because, one, you have the demographic homogeneity, where for whatever, who's living in Washington County, Maryland, what is their demographic makeup, what is their socioeconomic drivers, it's basic stuff on standard epidemiological limitations. But the other one more specific to the radium technique. And so they did what sounded like a pretty standard sort of 50 milligram, 2 applicators, 1 in each nostril, 8 to 12 minutes, done for 3 fractions, separated by 14 days. It seems pretty standard from what I can gather, but we don't know that. So we can't be certain, and I can say from my experience as an independently practicing radiation medicine doctor, that even what we consider standard, you'd be surprised at what happens out here. So I would bet that some of these radium applications, not in this study population, but it would be hard to extrapolate this to every person treated with radium brachy for this. But such is the nature, again, that it's not meant to throw stones at this particular study. This is a limitation of this work, and why a lot of these things need to be interpreted much more cautiously than we have been. And Same with the recall bias. Now, fortunately, with recall bias, it's hard to not recall if you got cancer or not. So it's probably limited in terms of how much this affects it, but that is a thing we need to be aware of. But primarily is the sample size and the statistical power here. So they're resting their hats on thyroid and brain. But again, it's nonsense. You got 3 brain tumors, malignant brain tumors in the exposed and 0 in the unexposed. You got 2 thyroid cancers in the exposed and 1 in the unexposed. And you have so small numbers that you have to do Halliday's correct. You have to artificially add in numbers to even do the stats. And that right there should kind of stop you in the track. But it's science. You can't publish negative data. This is a big, the positive bias in the scientific literature is just, you're looking at it. You're looking at the result of you can't publish negative data, because I think this data is valuable no matter what. And this is what drives me nuts. I would read negative studies. I would love it, because it would give us a better, what are we missing? Or how much work is being redundantly done because negative things are being published? Obviously, many of us have gone on this rant in science and medicine, but come on. They had to make this. They had to find something. And they did. It's garbage, but they found it and they published it. And, specifically for these sorts of things, especially because they're all epidemiologists, statisticians, Poisson regression is an interesting choice. And, there could have been others. Now, again, I'm not there. I'm not actually a statistician. I don't know what a lot of these things, but you could exact Poisson or Bayesian methods you could have used. I'm not into this. I don't want to get into the Bayes crap, but these are, what's driving me nuts reading this is the level of statistics that I would do as an armchair statistician. So obviously I'm trained in molecular biology and medicine, and I have a working knowledge of statistics that I mostly taught myself. And when people who are epidemiologists, who should be fairly strong in this, are doing the same things that I would do, it kind of sets my alarm bells off a little bit. You guys should be better at this than me. And it's a little concerning. But, anyone who knows anything about statistics, again, elementary school level, should look at those confidence intervals and know it's crazy. And I'm looking at that. I'm looking at you, Dr. Rubin, the 2017 paper. But, to make any claims, so even our colleagues here, and I'm not going to name names. So if you look at the citations for this paper, the 55 citations, there's some of our colleagues in radiation oncology who have cited this paper, making claims about pediatric brain tumors in particular. And a confidence interval is 0.76 to 286.3. That's bananas. If you think you can infer anything from that, you should probably go back and redo undergrad, because that's sort of ridiculous. But then specific to us and kind of insider baseball that epidemiologists would probably not know is these exposure measurements. So if you go into the introduction and stuff, people are estimating what the various structures around the head and neck were getting for dose, because they don't know. So we forget this in our era of computers and VMAT and Monte Carlo algorithms. All of that is a guess. We actually don't know. And there's a reason in vivo dosimeters exist. And what you see in Eclipse is probably not necessarily what's happening in real life, especially as it pertains to small structures on the surface. And it gets even worse in this paper, where they're relying on the estimates made in the 70s based on skull films and anatomical sites, guessing what the dosimetry was. And so that's important that this paper's not making a lot of claims necessarily on the dose response in terms of the extrapolating the effective dose, but others do. And it's a guess. Okay. And you could do the same treatment to 10 individuals, but the dose to surrounding tissues in those 10 individuals might be totally different in every single one of them. And we just don't know. So it's really hard. You can know, so, there's known knowns and known unknowns, but it's the unknown unknowns that are going to get you. And so in this case, that you had these people who got radium brachy when they were kids. So you know that. And based on what they told you think that they got cancer later on, some of them, very few of them. But what you don't know is really how much dose any of those surrounding tissues got. So if you're making claims about thyroid cancer, like, 2 in the exposed and 1 in the unexposed, you have no idea how much dose that thyroid, because if you think about it, the thyroid, if you're doing nasopharyngeal brachy with applicator, the thyroid's pretty far away. And if you're a tiny kid and you get this, your chances of getting more dose to your thyroid is better than if you're a big kid or an older adult. But it's really hard to make inferences about thyroid cancer from nasopharyngeal brachy, just thinking logically about it, right? Now, the real kicker, and why I chose this paper in particular, is what they did and did not say, and what this paper is really about. It's going back to my speculations about the author. So again, I think this was really driven by Sandler and Malinowski on their earlier work, because what this paper really shows is a significantly decreased incidence of hormone-related cancers. And so they have a figure, it's their only figure in this paper, it's towards the end. So if you remember in the abstract, they only have a narrative sentence about the decreased incidence of the hormone-related cancers. They don't really give you any numbers. They spend the majority of the paper talking about the thyroid and brain crap, which is garbage. And again, I hope the authors listen to this podcast one day. But towards the end, in like the second or third to last page of before the references, you have figure 1. Figure 1 is a survival curve, and it's titled Cumulative Incidence of Breast, Endometrium, Ovary, or Prostate Cancer Among Exposed and Non-Exposed Patients. And it has a massive, massive difference between the exposed and unexposed. And I misspoke, it's not a survival curve, it's cumulative incidence. But the people who got nasopharyngeal radiation as a kid have significantly fewer rates or incidences of these hormone-related cancers than the unexposed. It's massive. It's clear as day. It's better than some of the new drugs that are coming out. And they talk about in the discussion finally. So then when the discussion comes, they barely mention this. When the discussion comes, they spend all this time talking about how bad radiation is, how it causes all those brain tumors, and it's just garbage, just garbage. And they don't get to this finding until close to the very end. And they write, I'll read here, the irradiated women had lower rates of breast cancer than did non-irradiated women, despite the fact that the exposed group had a slightly higher frequency of risk factors commonly associated with the risk of breast cancer. The exposed group was older, better educated, older at their first pregnancy, younger at puberty, older at menopause, and they had a lower risk of breast cancer. And yet they had a lower risk of breast cancer. A decreased risk of breast cancer in irradiated individuals was also observed in a similar study done in the Netherlands. And then that Hazen study that we looked at from Sandler's dissertation earlier. And they then go on to write that their study found that the risk of endometrial, ovarian, and prostate cancers were lower in the irradiated group. The findings lead to speculation that alterations of hormone levels from pituitary radiation might have been responsible for the decreased cancer rates among the exposed subjects. They hypothesize appropriately, I feel like, that perhaps the proximity of the pituitary gland, much closer to the thyroid, could have led to some level of damage that caused underfunction, or who knows why. But it is a plausible mechanistic hypothesis. And here's the kicker. This is really what got me, why I thought this was worth talking about. In almost the final paragraph of discussion at the end of this paper, we have the line, the relation between low-dose pituitary radiation and hormone-related cancers has not been documented in other studies. However, an inverse relation between risk of breast cancer and pelvic radiotherapy has been found in several populations. Serologic studies further reveal that estrogen concentrations were reduced among irradiated women, which might explain the reduced risk of breast cancer. Similar hormonal changes might occur after pituitary radiation. So let's really think about what that means, right? So this paper, the way it's framed, is about the excess risk of brain and thyroid cancer from nasopharyngeal brachy. Their data is garbage. Their statistics are garbage. And they throw in at the very end of the abstract this thing about reduced rates of hormone-related cancers. And they had this crazy incidence curve of significantly reduced. And if you look at the numbers, so remember 2 versus 1 of thyroid cancer, 3 versus 0 brain cancer. So when you look at breast, endometrium, and ovarian cancer, there are 7 cases in the exposed group and 27 cases in the unexposed group. So the relative risk is 0.51. Now the relative risk still crosses 1. It goes from 0.21 to 1.19. That is the strongest statistical piece of this whole paper right there. That's quite crazy, is that the best thing they have, the most robust thing they have, they ignore. Furthermore, the most robust thing they have is novel. As they say, buried in the discussion. This has never been shown before. So they show an almost cut in half relative risk of these hormone-related cancers. Never been shown before, and it is buried. And it is not why this paper is cited. This paper is cited as proof about the dangers of radiation. And this is just, I'm flabbergasted seeing this. They have to add in Halliday's correction, add in numbers to make the other stuff even semi-plausible. It's not really plausible if you read for half a second, and then they just bury this really interesting finding, novel finding, that nasopharyngeal brachy had reduced the rates of these hormone-related cancers. Further in this table, this is table 4, if you look, all neoplasms except skin. So they have an all-comers sort of thing. So in the exposed group for all comers, there are 41 cases of cancer of any type in the exposed group. There are 83 cases of cancer in the unexposed group, all type. The relative risk of that is 1.02. So when you pool the analysis, it is almost 1. It is almost 1-to-1. And to even make a bad argument, they have to go into subsets and add in numbers that don't exist. I'd never heard of Halliday's correction before this. And then they have this really neat finding that's never been seen before that they totally ignore. And that's why I spent so much time earlier kind of talking about the authors in the byline, because what I suspect, having been in this world, you have these people who are just finishing grad school, starting postdocs, and then you have these very senior people, Comstock, Sandler, and Madanowski. And they were building, so I think Madanowski and Sandler had done that initial work in 1978, 1979, and they were building on that data set. I could see, well, it depends on how bold they are, so maybe they ignored it. If I were these new postdocs, I would have been very excited about this. So I would have seen this and been a wow. And I would have brought this data saying, like, look, this is totally novel. It's never been seen before. Oh, but where they failed, what they didn't know was that didn't fit the narrative. This really interesting, totally novel finding, the most robust finding of this paper, it does not fit the narrative. It does not fit the mainstream establishment narrative that all radiation is bad. No radiation is safe. And of course, giving kids nasopharyngeal radiation was bad and stupid, and we should regret it and feel bad forever. And now, at least they didn't discard this data. They couldn't, because it's good, it's interesting. So they allowed it in the paper, but this was not what the thrust of this paper was about. And it is not how this paper is cited. And I think this is very important for us to know and to look at. And again, this takes a lot of effort, and very few of us may be classically trained in radiation biology, but these things you can find these things. And so in these discussions and debate, as benign radiotherapy is going through this renaissance here in America right now, and we have the old guard coming out arguing about risk of cancer, really, you got to push back. So that's the thing. So number one, I'm not making the claim, again, just to get the straw man out of the way, radiation is not risk-free. There are risks. It needs to be treated with respect and very thoughtfully. And that's not the argument I'm making here, that we can just go hog wild with this. But, the boogeyman of radiation is wrong, and it persists because you don't push back. And I know it's uncomfortable, and I know many of you are stuck in the ivory tower and can't be out here in the woods like me, just yelling into the void. But the only way this changes is if you speak up. If when certain people say things like, good luck, you forgot about tinea capitis and ankylosing spondylitis, you got to say, come on, buddy. Like, no, this is bad garbage data. It's all made up. I shouldn't say that, but it's, I think I said on the internet the other day, it's compounding disease. This is what I mean. When I say compounding disease, it's the legacy of what we're seeing here, where there were those bad papers done in the 50s and 60s, cited in bad papers in 70s and 80s, cited in bad papers in 2000s, cited in bad papers to today. So you can trace the lineage of this flawed thinking, the compounding deceits, very easily if you just spend a little bit of time. It took me longer to record all this stuff than it did to find this stuff. And the only way we can change this and really kind of actually know what's happening, because there is a risk to radiation. Don't get me wrong, there is a risk. I don't know what it is. And that's what drove me nuts about doing my PhD in radiation biology, is to this day when patients ask me, what is the risk of the radiation you're going to give me causing cancer? I don't know. And I did my PhD in this. Do you know how insane that makes me? It's insane. And part of why I don't know is this crap is, for anyone who's taken the rad bio boards or remembers it, a lot of it doesn't make sense. And this is why. It's because we're trying to fit the why. We're trying to make the data fit the theory instead of the other way around. So when you have these confusing corrections and talking about the shoulder and the linear part of the alpha beta, you find that confusing because it is confusing. Because when Muller was doing his work in the 20s and 30s and 40s in claiming point mutation when it was really chromosomal damage, remember that work was being done before they had the helical structure of DNA, right? And the reason a lot of it doesn't make sense is since the time of the birth of the LNT model, we discovered pesky things like a DNA damage response and repair, and all these other sort of molecular mechanisms that help our bodies, help the cells deal with exposure to radiation. And to anyone who's in who's already been on this argument for longer than I have, you got to stop tying in hormesis with this, okay? So they're two separate things. Whenever I read the literature from you guys, who I love you guys, so thank you, but you can't make the jump of LNT is wrong, there is a threshold, oh, and by the way, hormesis is real and radiation is good for you. Those are two arguments. You got to shelve hormesis for now. When you're trying to argue against the establishment, the only thing that you can focus on is just the fact that there is not a threshold is wrong. Do not try to do, that's crazy, okay? That's two birds with one stone. The birds are too big for your stone. So I think the hormesis stuff is good. I think there's a lot of things there. If it's a separate domain, stop it, okay? But love you guys. But to all, especially the residents who listen to this, you're in a tough spot, but in the future and when appropriate, and don't be like me, okay? I like sticking my neck out because I'm a psychopath. Also, I don't care about brass rings or any of the other stuff. Don't be like me unless you really want to go down this road. But, when you're faculty, when you're attending, say these things, you don't have to necessarily push back in that moment. Because again, that's the other, you got to wait. But I waited just really, the podcast started after I was board certified. So just, pro tip on that one, and just for the future, don't be cantankerous. I didn't do this beforehand, right? Because you got to play the game to a certain point. Once you're free, you can do these things. But for the rest of us, if you're board certified, if you're out there, really reevaluate your own opinions on these things and take a look. And when your colleagues say stupid stuff, you call them out on it. But read these things, read the papers, take a look at it. Don't be uninformed when you make these arguments. But if you just say nothing, radiation oncologists are so conflict averse. Just nod your head and say, stop that. That's why we get into trouble. That's why things are the way they are. But I wanted to really explore this one sort of thread and illustrate why these things happen and why it's bad. And it's on us to fix this for the next generation. And I think we can, but you gotta push back a little. And it's not always fun. Actually, it's never fun. I actually hate that. It's kind of why I do this alone. But anyway, remember, not all radiation is bad, and letting wounds fester causes infection. So we'll talk to you guys later.
This has been a Photon Media production. Don't forget to like and subscribe on whatever platform you use to listen to us. Be well and be mom.